Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay, so I am sitting at the kitchen table and my notes are here. So instead of looking at you in the camera, I'll probably be doing a lot of this. I don't know how that's going to go. I do want to begin today with sort of an apology for what may seem, just this whole thing very different for all of us. I feel like this meeting has a number of challenges to it, not the least of which is maybe the impersonal nature of things. Uh, maybe it didn't feel that way so much as we were all updating and stuff, but I can say personally, when I preach and teach, I almost always am trying to, even though I have notes, to dialogue in my communication with the reactions and the faces and the expressions and everything I get from people all the way through. And that a lot of times really kind of ends up driving what ends up being the message, because I feel like it's a two-way kind of thing. It's not just a prepared speech or a performance or something. So I actually find myself scanning the pictures up top and seeing reactions, I guess. But I don't know how that's going to go. So we'll just kind of find out. But that's what the apologies for, I suppose. Also, I'm aware it's 11:45 right now as I'm beginning, so I want to be mindful of that, everybody's time. But one thing this allows me to do is something I've talked to some of you about trying to do a long time back, and it's just never worked out. But those of you familiar with John Piper's Look at the Book and the kind of video series that he does, where he kind of puts the text out in front of you and is kind of working through the text with you and diagramming things and pointing things out. That's something I've wanted to have at our meetings, if at all possible, for a long time. This allows me to do that. And so I'm not sure how much you're actually going to be seeing me once I get started anyway. I'm going to be kind of trying to focus squarely on the text and working through that and making some applications and points based on that. So that's where I'll be, and kind of the way I hope to approach all this. So if you would, you could open in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25, we will be considering, some of you may remember the book of Genesis is broken up into 11 told-out sections, or these are the generations of, and we actually will be considering the end of one told-out section and another entire told-out section. And so we do all that in 18 verses. Genesis 25, verses 1 through 18. So I will just read, you can read along with me, those 18 verses. Beginning in verse 1, you remember this is actually not the told out section of Abraham, but the told out section of Terah, his father. And this is what became of him. He had a son who God, plucked out of his paganism and made promises and oaths and worked in his life and taught him so much and bore through so much of his sin, bore with him. And we come to the end of Abraham's life, and it's very terse in the way it goes over things here. But let's begin in verse 1. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Lemim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Henoch, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai. These are the generations of Ishmael. So we've finished now with Abraham, and now we jump into Ishmael. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the first of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedarmah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. And then just to see in verse 19, we start a new Toldot section, which are an accounting of what becomes of whoever's named. And it says in verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. And so the new section sets off what essentially saying, okay, well, what became of Isaac, Abraham's son? What happened there? And so that's kind of where we are. And again, the material today concerns the end of Abraham's part in biblical revelation, and that's kind of the end of an era, you may say. I mean, something new was started with Abraham in the Bible. God called a man out and covenanted with him that he would bless the world through him and through his, eventually through one of his descendants. And so, it's in one sense, it's been a thrill, even though we've gone through these stories that sometimes feel rather mundane and odd. They're foreign to us. They're from a different time and a different land and a different world almost. I trust as we've gone through, we've seen and been thankful to see a lot of the things that God was doing for Abraham in his life, what he was teaching him, and drawn lessons from that ourselves. And that's wonderful. But there comes a time Abraham dies, and we can't just keep reading about the things that happened to Abraham and be encouraged from him. His time is done. And if God is going to do what God said he would do, he's going to have to pick up then with his son and begin to work in his life and begin to bring these things about as time goes on. And so that's kind of what all this is about. We find in the middle of this, though, this bit about Ishmael, and that may at first seem very unrelated, other than, it's just, so he is a child of Abraham, big deal. Why do I need to read about what happened to Ishmael? I don't read a whole lot about what happened to these other men, and there's plenty of people mentioned in the Bible, and we don't learn about their descendants and what happens. But I trust we'll see some reasons for that as well by the time we're done. So anyway, with this purpose of kind of changing gears from Abraham on to Isaac and what becomes of him, Moses finishes off this material about Abraham but he does it with this, he kind of has the same concern that I think Abraham had at the end of his life. And we saw in the last few chapters that Abraham seemed very concerned to kind of set things up for Isaac in such a way that the promises of God would come to pass. He gets word about his family, his brother having descendants, and it kind of just he gets that news, and it stops there at the end of chapter 23, and then the end of chapter 22, and then in chapter 23 we read all about Sarah's death, and we see to what pains Abraham went to make sure that they had a new ancestral burial plot in the promised land. They didn't have to go back anywhere else. That he was kind of, not only was he establishing something in the promised land, but he was also went to great lengths to make sure that Isaac felt like his roots belonged in Canaan and not just in Haran where they had come from. Then the next chapter, 24, he's concerned that his son doesn't have a wife. He's 37 years old, and there's no wife, and there's none of the women in Canaan seem suitable to him for various reasons, probably mostly religious reasons, even though his family were pagans as well. They're familiar, and the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And also they had been, it seems, supportive of his following after this God who had appeared to him and called him. And so he wants his servant to go back there and get a bride from his family. And he even tells him, do not take a bride from these Canaanite women, and whatever you do, do not allow Isaac to go back to the land I came from and back with the family. Bring someone from there over here. And we see then in chapter 24 that God wonderfully provided, and the recurring theme that happens again and again in that chapter is it's said that God showed his steadfast love and faithfulness to Abraham. And so we see this continue to be worked out. Abraham was very concerned that Isaac not abandon the promises of God, but that all that God had done in Abraham's life wouldn't be lost and wasted, and we could move forward. So he's got this great concern. And I think Moses has this concern also, to show in the text that Isaac is in fact Abraham's heir, and Isaac is in fact the one through whom all the promises and covenants will pass. And I think that is part of what happens here. He knows, we don't know it yet, but he knows, Moses knows, and the historical record that they had available to them showed that Abraham had other sons. There were people in the land of Canaan who, if you were to say, well, God promised this land to Abraham, our father, they would say, he's our father too, and we're going to stay. And that wasn't to be the case. That wasn't to be what happened. And so Moses goes through pains here to show what happened with these other descendants of Abraham. And in doing so, he establishes Isaac as the rightful heir. He does it quickly. That's part of what is going on in this chapter, or this first 18 verses of this chapter. One thing I want you to notice is that we can divide this section up into three subsections, you might say. Verses 1 through 6 essentially deal with Abraham and Keturah and the relationship of all of their relationship and the relationship of her children, what becomes of them, and how they relate to Isaac and his claim to be the sole heir of Abraham. And then the next verses, 7 through 11, is essentially the death report of Abraham and his burial. And then verses 12 through 18 simply deal with Ishmael and what became of Ishmael. So those kind of three sections. Now, what else can I say about this before we just dive right into the text? Since Abraham had other sons, there is, again, the need to identify what happened to them and to identify what peoples they have become. In both instances, these lists, both of Ishmael and of the sons of Keturah, these lists serve to demonstrate the faithfulness of God to his promises that are already made to Abraham. So not only are they showing that that Isaac is in fact the only legitimate heir of Abraham, but they also demonstrate the faithfulness of God to Abraham, to promises God made to Abraham about these individual people before they were born, or sometimes after they were born, but about their future. So all of that in turn then sets the stage for us to consider God's faithfulness to Abraham in Isaac's life, which is getting ready to come up. So in other words, as we close Abraham's section and finish that, we at the same time launch out into something new. And the closing thoughts we have about Abraham as that section closes is powerful reminders about the faithfulness of God to every word promised to Abraham. And then if we launch out of the new one, we ought to be thinking about the faithfulness of God. We ought to be hopeful about the faithfulness of God that we're going to see in Isaac's life. And so that's a big part of what's happening as well. So then, with that said, I'm going to try to share screen with you all. And okay, let's see how this works. Are you all seeing that? Someone unmute themselves and tell me if you're seeing that.
I see it.
Okay, now one more test here. Do you see that, Mark?
Yep, see it.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Here we go.
Yep.
All right, so I want to just kind of begin here, verses 1 through 6, this first section. I want you to notice that there are 4 actions that Abraham takes. So we have Abraham took. In verse 5, we have Abraham gave. In verse 6, Abraham gave. And then later, it's a little bit hidden, but in verse 6, in the middle here, we have he sent. Now, let's ask some questions. What did he do? Abraham first, he took. What did he take? Another wife. Then Abraham gave all he had. Verse 6, Abraham gave gifts. And then also he sent them. So we're talking about the end of Abraham's life, and we find 4 actions for Abraham. When the scene opens, we have, if we've been reading Genesis, already learned of Abraham that he already had committed all that he had to Isaac. And if you turn in your Bibles to Genesis 24 and verse 36, we read, this is a report about Abraham's activity from his servant who went to Haran to try to find a wife for Isaac. And he says, and Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. So we're already familiar with that, or we could be, we should be. If that's the case. We know that's operating as a concern of Abraham's. We know from that, so we know that that's his disposition, and his intention is to give everything to Isaac. We got that again from that servant's report in chapter 24. So we know Abraham has a son, and that his son Isaac, though he's not his only son, we knew about Ishmael already. He is regarded as his sole heir, the recipient of all that he has. And so then we have an issue, and kind of a problem here, is that in verse 1, Abraham took another wife. That wife, her name was Keturah, right? Her name is Keturah. The wife is Keturah. Also, I would submit, and I've got another text to show you this, that concubines in verse 6, one of his concubines was also Keturah. If you turn with me or you don't have to 1 Chronicles, you'll see where this is plainly stated in the Bible that Keturah was not a typical wife, but was in fact a concubine. In 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and verse 32, we read, speaking about Abraham's descendants, it says, the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. She bore him, and you could be looking at the text in Genesis if you haven't turned to Chronicles. She bore him, this says, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And so you find the same list there. And so she is clearly a concubine. Now we have another issue. If you're looking at the screen here, we have an S at the end of concubine, concubines, plural, which raises a big question for some of us. It may, in that, what do you mean plural concubines? And, we could say that is just, there are other women who are just not listed. Some reason Keturah was listed and others were not. But it seems to me that Sarah had a servant whose name was Hagar, who became a concubine. And not only did she become a concubine of sorts, but a specific kind, namely a concubine wife, a woman who was given, though she was still a servant status, she was, she was considered a wife substitute. She was there to bear children in Sarah's name. So what exactly? So she was a concubine as well. So I think that's what it means by concubines plural. Now the question, I guess, is what exactly was the nature of Keturah's relationship with Abraham? When did he marry her? I would like to think that he did not marry Keturah while Sarah was still alive, that he would have learned his lesson with the massive problems that came into the family when he began to treat Hagar in some ways as a wife. The text actually says that Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham as a wife, even though she remained her servant. So there's no way to know. In point of fact, we can't know conclusively. But I guess that my question would be, what does the text emphasize? It seems to me as if the text here in Genesis emphasizes Keturah as a wife, that it's likely that Abraham married her or took her as a wife, as it says, took another wife, after Sarah died. But if it happened, if it emphasizes her nature, her status as a concubine, then there's really no way to know. And I think because it introduces her as a wife, I think it's emphasizing her status as a wife. The other thing is, you think about Abraham. Here's a guy who was traveling around in an unknown land without protection. And the way that you formed alliances was through marriages. Now, he didn't have any sons, and he knew you formed these alliances through marriages. And so he told his wife, Sarah, to lie about who she was. And so they could, form alliances and treaties and things, and she would marry. And he did that twice to his shame. But God protected him. But, if Abraham's that crafty and creative, what's to keep him from, buying some servant and passing some servant off as a daughter or something and forming an alliance that way, and this sort of thing, or from taking a wife, for paying some big sum of money to take a wife from these other peoples that were living in the land. He avoided that all the time, and he had one wife whose name was Sarah for all these years. And so I don't think it's likely that Abraham would take another wife, as a rival wife to Sarah. That's something of a weak argument, and that Abraham has shown that times in his life he's been less than admirable in the way he's treated her. But it's the only argument I make. I don't insist that you put Keturah as a wife who came after the fact, but that's the way I read it. And there's no real argument that can be made one way or the other from the text. It's just a matter of how you read it, I guess, what your feeling is. Now, the other issue is if Sarah died when Abraham was 137 years old, then that's an issue. He's 137. We know he dies at 175 years old. And so that leaves 38 years from the time he would potentially marry Keturah to the time that he has from Keturah. Hang on here. Let me make sure we're. From Keturah, she has these, in verse 2, she has these sons. And they, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And so the sons that she has, she's going to have, that's 6 sons, and she's got 38 years to have them. I don't know when Abraham would have sent them all away, but my assumption is he probably sent them all away at once. And I say that because when he sent Ishmael away, he sent Ishmael and Hagar away, both. And if he was sending these men away kind of one at a time, it does, to me, seem a little bit odd that he wouldn't have sent Keturah away with them at the same time. And so I think it's likely that maybe he had these sons, and then, at some point he just sent the whole clan of them away, the whole group of them. It's possible that he waited until each child, became of age and sent them away. But with that 38-year time span, that becomes a little bit difficult. I don't know. I mean, he's got 6 kids. It doesn't take long to get 6 kids, but then, the time that last one is mature enough to go, it seems like that's just a long time. So I kind of think maybe he sent them all away at once, gave them all gifts, and sent them all off. That's kind of my own take. Again, that's rather conjecture, but that's where I'm at with my understanding of all of that. Now, another interesting thing here is, uh-oh, the pen's not working. Let's see what happens here. Just one second, sorry. Bear with me. Oh no. All right, well, looks like we're going to be done with the marks. Maybe that's for the best, but okay. So you'll notice in this text, in these 6 verses, it almost, we got these verbs here where, hang on a minute. What's going on here? Okay, well, anyway, so these verbs we have, you got to have a picture. It's an odd thing. Abraham takes another wife, and at the end, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. He did that, it says, while he was still living. Now, it's a curious picture. Here he is. He's got his son Isaac, and we find him. What does he do? He takes this woman, and then at the end of the 6 verses, he sends them away. In between, he gives. We're told he gave twice. He gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. So he takes another wife, has children with her, then he sends all these kids away. But before he does something specific. He gives them all gifts. He gives them something of an inheritance. Not exactly an inheritance. It's called gift, not an inheritance. I think that's important. They don't have an inheritance with Abraham, but he does, with all the wealth and the blessing that he has, he does give them gifts, sends them away. So that the idea is that none of these children of Abraham, through Keturah, the children of Keturah, as it says in verse 4, leave from Abraham empty-handed or feeling that they've been slighted or mistreated or abused, that they somehow need to come back and take from Isaac what belonged to them. They were sons that, yes, Abraham treated their mother something like a wife, but she was a concubine, and they could have been sent away with nothing, but he gave them gifts and kind of set them up as best he could when he sent them off. And so this was because he had committed to give all that he has to Isaac as the sole heir. And God himself had insisted on this, that Isaac would be the heir. So he gives gifts to all these other sons of his and sends them away. They get gifts. They're not sent away, with hatred by an unloving father. They are sent away, though, nonetheless. So I want you to see that. To the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Okay, so what do we say about this? Abraham did what he did to secure the inheritance for Isaac and to ensure that it would be unchallenged and without a rival. Step back just a bit here and think about how this happened with Ishmael. Ishmael was, let's turn there, if you would, in your Bibles, to Genesis chapter 21, and just notice something. when Ishmael was sent out, in verse 9, Genesis 21:9, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Of course, that's the New Testament. Paul describes that as persecuting, and the word itself there doesn't just mean laughter. It's a mocking, an abusive kind of jesting. So it's likely to be physical as well. So she said to Abraham, cast out, not send away, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. You see the overtones there, the hostility, it seems like, to her, or at least to Ishmael, and even to Hagar, this slave woman. She's not going to be heir. Sarah is highlighting the fact of their legal status. Yes, Ishmael was Abraham's son, and Abraham had thought at one point that Ishmael would be the promised child, but he learned differently. And because of that, and because Ishmael was never considered to be Sarah's son, Ishmael is slave status, and so is Hagar's mother. And as slaves, they will not have an inheritance with the heir, with Abraham's rightful heir. And due to his behavior, due to Ishmael's wrong behavior, and due to his servant status, Sarah says, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And we read in verse 11, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. So he loved Ishmael, he didn't want to do it. But notice her reasoning. Sarah's reasoning is, this slave woman, the son of the slave woman, shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And then God responds in verse 12, but God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. What do you think? Why? Because through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So there's that. Send the child out, because Sarah's right. This child will have no inheritance. Your descendants shall be named only through Isaac. And the way that matters to God, it's only through Isaac. It doesn't matter how many other children Abraham has. His descendants are going to come through and be counted through the line of Isaac. And it's through Isaac that he says that your, what does he say? Through Isaac shall your offspring be named, or the real inheritance, the blessing. Everything will come through Isaac. And so send out Ishmael, send him away. And so we read that then in chapter 21, verse 10, again, he won't be heir with Isaac. And then verse 12, it's through Isaac that your offspring shall be named. So you see one time where Sarah says this, displeasing to Abraham. God says, do what she says. She's right in what she's thinking. And then God also says it's through Isaac that your offspring shall be named. So through Sarah and through God, Abraham has it on good authority that Isaac is the only one. Of course, God said the same thing in Genesis chapter 17 when he was telling him that it was through this child, Isaac, that he was going to covenant afterwards to bring all the blessing that he had promised Abraham would come to the world. Now, so that's where we are. As we move on then into the next section, verses 7 through 11, there are some things we could say here. So I got that pen working again now. Verse 7 says, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife after the death of Abraham. God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Laharoi. Now, this is an amazing text for a couple of reasons. One, we could say, although he's not the only one to do it and his son will outlive him, first of all, he lived 175 years. And that's not insignificant because the text brings this up. Look how many times this says, He died in a good old age, an old man, full of years. I mean, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 times we've been told about his old age, just in these 2 verses. And God had promised that to Abraham, that he would live in he would die in peace. Remember in Genesis chapter 15, when God covenants with him, he says in Genesis 15:15, as for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. That was specifically promised him. And it happened. And so it's a big deal. Also, one other thing that shows kind of the peacefulness of his death is when it says, and full of years. That word full is there, but the of years is something added that's not in the original. It's just full, and the idea of full is really satisfied. He's content. He died an old man and satisfied. And some of our translations add of years, and it's not a bad translation. That sounds like it's actually faithful, like this faithful to the meaning of the text. That when it says and full or and satisfied, and that it usually when somebody's end of life, when they bring that up, it's particularly, they're satisfied with their years. They're full of years. It's that kind of meaning. But the actual of years is not there. So I say that to demonstrate that you might kind of underline full in your Bibles. He's full of years. Like he's got what he needs. God's given him all that was promised. He died specifically in a good old age, as specifically was promised. And his years were good. He died as an old man, 175 years old. And so this is where we are. Anyway, so he's lived for this long, just to point that out. Then it says he was gathered to his people, which I think is something of just an idiom. It does not refer to his death, and it does not refer to his burial. So it's not his death, it's not his burial, it's something else. He's gathered to his people. We know it doesn't refer to a burial. You might have a sentence like this where we're talking about his burial in different ways. He was gathered to his people. He was buried in the ancestral plot, something like that, but that's what it means. But it can't mean that, because Moses, this is also used of Moses, and Moses was not buried with his people. And I can't remember, there's one other person as well in Genesis that it's used, and they were not buried with their people. So it's something else. I think it likely refers to I think the idea of an afterlife, and that he's gathered to his people in that sense. Something of we're at a dim place in biblical revelation about the afterlife at this point. There's not much that's known. This is the way of speaking about that. He's gathered to his people. And there he is. So there's that bit. Now, what else to say about this? Very curious statement, I think, in verse 9. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, plural, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. That's interesting for a couple reasons. First of all, when the sons of Keturah, think about this in verse 4, all these were the children of Keturah. So she bore him these men, and then we read about all those descendants that they had. And it says all these were children of Keturah. It doesn't say these were, his sons, except for then in verse 6, what does it say here? The sons of his concubines. It's not, the text doesn't describe them as Abraham's son, the sons of his concubines. And we know that Ishmael's mother was one of his concubines for a brief time. So it's a bit odd. It's also odd, it's very odd, because God says in Genesis chapter 22, when Abraham is commanded to sacrifice Isaac, in chapter 22 and verse 2, God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Your only son, Isaac. So for God, Isaac is the only son. Now, we know that's not literally true, but it's the one whom God is considering the only rightful son. What we see in these texts, what we've seen from what God did with Keturah and her children, is that Abraham feels the same way, that Isaac is the one, and all that he had goes to Isaac, because Isaac is his only son. But in the middle of a text that's concerned to elevate Isaac and to dismiss the claims of the other sons, we're told that also Ishmael is his son, and these two sons buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Now, I've brought this up in times past, but I'll just say this. Isaac and Ishmael are the only two sons that Abraham ever had that at one point in their life, he thought they were the promised sons. Ishmael was probably 17 when he was sent away due to his persecuting behavior and lewd behavior towards Isaac. But Isaac, of course, all his life was assumed to be the promised son. Ishmael was sent away when he was about 17, and under circumstances that were less than favorable. I know these other sons, these of concubines, got gifts, but it didn't really seem to be that way with Ishmael. When he was sent out, man, it's pretty rough. He's sent out in Genesis 21, verse 14 says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away." So the great gift from all of Abraham's wealth that Ishmael got was a skin of water and some bread. And it didn't last long. John, in verse 15 of chapter 21, we read, "When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, 'Let me not look on the death of the child.'" So just a meager supplies they were sent out to get them kind of part way on their way into the desert before they could die. This is what he sent him away with. Not much of a gift. Abraham gave gifts. What did Ishmael get? It didn't seem like much. But Ishmael, in fact, got a whole lot more. He was given much more, because given to Abraham to pass on to Ishmael was not all the promises that God had given him and the covenant, but was some other promise. Also in Genesis 21, we read in verse 13, God says this to Abraham, "And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." And then we can back up even further to Genesis 16 and see something else God had said about this boy. Genesis 16, verses 11 and 12. "And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him." And listen. And then it says, "And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." He shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. What a thing. Then also again in Genesis chapter 17, I need to go back here down to verse 20 and see something else that God says about Ishmael. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." He'll father 12 princes. So there's a number of things that God has said about Ishmael here. And we'll see in the next section how those things come to fruition. But right now, just to say that Ishmael, why would Ishmael come and bury Abraham? I think because even though it seems harsh that he's sent out and he's cast out, he's kind of booted out of the camp, and they go out into the desert, they find very quickly that God, the things that God told Abraham wasn't, or the things that Abraham said, "Well, God told me these things will work out for you." It wasn't a lie. That God had said those things, and God had in fact taken care of Ishmael. That really did happen. The Lord looked after him. We find in Genesis 21 verse 20 or verse 19, "And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink, And God was with the boy. And he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So God was undertaking for Ishmael in earthly and physical ways, like he had promised Abraham. And so I think Ishmael isn't bitter towards Abraham. And so when Abraham comes to the end of his days, Ishmael goes to see him during his last days. And so I think it's likely that Abraham, who had sent all his children away, was surrounded on his deathbed or in his last days by Isaac and by Ishmael. I don't think it's likely that Abraham died and the news was sent to Ishmael, and then Ishmael came up and helped bury him. I don't think news traveled that way, that fast. I think Isaac and Ishmael are there at the end of his time. They see their father die, and they bury him together. And they bury him where? In the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites, where Abraham wanted to be buried, this new ancestral burial plot. Imagine the scene as Ishmael buries Abraham in this plot that he's not allowed to be buried in, but that Sarah has already been buried in. What feelings must have come up during that time. And then what do we read? Verse 11, more about the faithfulness of God. After the death of Abraham, God blessed who? Isaac, his son. And Isaac settled at Beer Laharoi. That's a curious statement because Beer Laharoi has also come up again. And it comes up in the story of Ishmael. Go back to Genesis 16. We'll read it again. Genesis 16, verse 13. Hagar goes on a naming spree here. Verse 13, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Laharoi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. So now what you see there is that Beer Laharoi was a place, it meant what? It meant, Beer Laharoi means something like the well of the living one who sees me. So the God who sees has seen me, right? For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. So the one who sees has seen me. This is the well of that place. And, she's not there anymore, certainly. I mean, she went back to Abraham and to Sarah, and then later after that, she was sent out and settled down out somewhere out elsewhere. But here at Beer Laharoi, kind of out on the edge of the promised land, Isaac settles. This is after the death of Abraham. He has received everything from Abraham. He goes out, he settles at Beer Laharoi. Why choose that? I don't know, but I think it's significant that it's there. At the place where the God who sees him. That's where he wants to live and make his settlement. Still living out there in tents, but he's there. Something else to know, even though that Abraham's death is recorded here in this chapter, and then the birth of Jacob and Esau doesn't happen until the next chapter. If you look at all the years of everyone, Abraham lived, I think it would have been like 15, 16 years. I don't have that chart in front of me, but it would be 15 years. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born to him. And Abraham would have known those twin boys for the first 15 years of their life. They would have been gathered together surely at around Abraham's deathbed as well. So you get all of that. But Isaac moves out to Beer Laharoi, where God, you might say the clue, the hint that Moses is giving us here is that he moves out somewhere where God's eye is upon him to look after him and to care for him and to fulfill all that he's promised he would do. Now, if we move on to the next section, verses 12 through 18, the last section here, there's some other things to see. This now is Ishmael's Toldat, the Toldat section of Ishmael. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael. And of course, none of us care at all about their names, but we should. And let's read here. Named in the order of their birth. Notice this. Named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael. And Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by, which I think is the same as in the order of, their villages, and by, or in the order of, their encampments. And this seems strange. Is it their birth order or their villages and encampments? What are we to make of this? What's actually true? Well, I think both are true. Just like think about the people of Israel. You could name them according to their birth order and according to their villages and their encampments, because they each are the separate clan. God was upon them, God's to bless them in such a way that those 12 sons of Jacob actually became 12 clans. And think about how rare that is in a sense. I mean, most of us, we're happy if we can trace our lineage, backward just a few generations. And we don't think that our ancestor, we don't assume that our ancestor is going to have been the father of this great multitude of people, who become a real established group. That just doesn't usually happen, but it happened for them. These were, just as God promised Abraham. He promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 21. He promised him. He said, what does it say here? That he would make him into 12 nations. And so that's massively significant. Sorry, not 21. It was in chapter 17. He says, as for Ishmael, I've heard it. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. So there will be 12 princes. And that's exactly what we find. There are 12 princes. And the hand of God was upon Ishmael in the same way the hand of God was upon Isaac, in terms of their, giving them eventually 12 sons who would become 12 princes in a sense. Jacob, Isaac's son, had 12 children, and those boys become tribes and become villages and encampments of people. And this is the same is true for Ishmael. And so you see the literal fulfillment, the exact word for word fulfillment of what God had promised he would do for Ishmael. Yes, this is in the order of their birth. That's true. But it's also true, because of God's hand upon them, that these became encampments of people. As it says in verse 16, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are princes. These are men who rule. And so it's significant. Now, so that, I think that's a wonderful just point to note, is that you see that God blessed him big time. What else do you see about Ishmael? He lived 137 years old. You might say he lived to be full of years. And then he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. So this is all good things that happened for Ishmael. But notice also here, Ishmael is described, though, as Abraham's son, but whom Hamor the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. So it's Abraham's son, but it's also from Hagar, Sarah's servant. So he's still considered one of these sons of the concubines. He sent him away like he sent the others away, because Isaac was the only one who would be his descendant. What else do you find? If you go back to Genesis chapter 16, in verse 12, we read again, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Look at verse 18. He settled, or dwelled, as it says in Genesis 16, over against all his kinsmen. Now, some of your translations might do some different things there. But let's say opposite his kinsman, or over against, or near, or something like that. But the idea literally really is over against. It's that he's settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He was an Egyptian, you remember. He was born from Hagar the Egyptian. They went down. He took an Egyptian wife. We know that from elsewhere in Genesis, in chapter 21. And then he settles from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite the direction of Assyria. When I say thus, he settled over against all his kinsmen. He settled over against them, which means that at least this idea that him settling over against his kinsmen is geographical. But it's also more than that, because it's when it's first mentioned, it's talking about his being a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And you see this historically, and here's what I mean, is that these tribes, these Nabaoth and Kedar and Abdil and Mibsam, Misha, Duma, Massa, all these different tribes, we don't know specifically about every one, but between archaeologists and what they found, and between what the rest of the Bible says, something like 7 of these are named elsewhere. And every time they're associated with the same geographical area, this area from Havilah to Shur, opposite Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. It's associated with those areas, but they are all desert tribes. They're Bedouin. They're traveling tribes who travel around. They're mobile. They don't settle anywhere. And they're also known, several of them, for kind of making raids all the time against who? Their kinsmen, the Egyptians and the other people who live out there. And so this is exactly what happens. And so word for word, everything God promised Ishmael, again, it happens. God brings it about. It's remarkable. And so what I want to say is, as all this closes, again, I mentioned earlier, with Abraham, we're just inundated not only with these facts about what's happening with these descendants of Ishmael and the sons of Keturah, but also about the fulfillment of what God had promised to Abraham, the faithfulness of God to Abraham. Everything that he said is coming to pass, and we shouldn't miss that. One other thing that happens, if you look at Genesis 17, please turn there. I want you to see something else we find in Genesis 17. God comes and makes some promises and a covenant to Abraham. And he says in Genesis 17, beginning in verse 4, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." Now, that you might be thinking, I'm getting ready to talk about all these people here, the sons of Keturah. And I am, but not yet. This father of a multitude of nations is something that we know is fulfilled not in a physical sense. The Bible picks this up everywhere and speaks about Abraham having a fatherly relationship to the nations, to all the nations. And that happens in the gospel. He becomes the father of the faithful, the father of the faith. He becomes the one we imitate. It is through him that we are blessed. He is Father Abraham, and through one of his sons, we all get blessing. And so he is, in that sense, our father. God puts him in a fatherly relationship with the nations. But there's also a sense, as we keep reading in Genesis 17, look at verse 5. "No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." All the same thing here. Then verse 6, there's something else. "And I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you." So God is going to be God to Abraham and to at least some portion of his offspring after him. But specifically, he is going to make Abraham himself into nations, plural, and kings shall come from you. When Keturah is taken as a wife, she bears Abraham Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Lumim. So The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldah. These are significant places. Again, these are places, I mean, we know the Midianites. In Joseph's story, in Joseph's story later in Genesis, we come across, this is amazing, in terms of those who take him captive, we come across the Midianites who sell him to the Ishmaelites, right? Sell him to the Ishmaelites, who in turn sell him to the Midianites, who sell him to the Egyptians, who were Ishmael's, kin. What a thing. Later in Canaan, we are, some of these same names come up again as people who had settled Canaan. Something that happened, one other curious thing is, so again, to say this, point out that God is fulfilling his word for word, faithfully to Abraham about becoming nations. There are two names here I want to highlight, and then we'll start moving into some application of everything, just in terms of details of the text. Sheba and Dedan. If you were to turn with me to Genesis chapter 10, where this table of nations is concerned. And you remember Noah gets off the ark. He has three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we read about the whole world being populated by these men and their descendants. And I might remind you that Abraham is a descendant of Shem, specifically Shem. But in Genesis chapter 10, looking at verse 6, we find the sons of Ham, who was one of the other three boys of Noah. The sons of Ham, verse 6 says, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Notice that Canaan. I mean, that's interesting. Canaan, that's the Canaanites, the land of Canaan, where Abraham is living now. And look what it says. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sebteca. The sons of Ramah, Sheba and Dedan. Wait a minute. The sons of Ramah are Sheba and Dedan. Those are the same names we have in verse 3 here in our chapter 25. We're talking about people who live in the area of Canaan, it seems. Sheba and Dedan, those names. Then down to verse 15 of chapter 10. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. Heth, that name Heth. Every time in your Bible you read the word Hittites, that is literally sons of Heth. These equal each other, same thing. So as the Hittites, when Abraham, purchased this field from the Hittites, purchased this cave, Ephron was a Hittite. The Hittites, the sons of Heth from Canaan. But these Sheba and Dedan seem to be not Canaanites in terms of they're not from Canaan. They are rather sons of Ham, sons of Ramah, sons of Ham, but who are sons of Cush even. Now, these are actually place names too. They're not just people names, they're place names. So we've got a text in Genesis 10 that says Sheba and Dedan come from Ramah, who comes from Cush, who comes from Ham. But then they're living in a land of Canaan, who descends from Ham, not from, who descends from Ham also, but it's a different relation, different line. So in the Canaan land, you have Sheba and Dedan, who are sons of Ham in their own right, not descended from Canaan. And now in Genesis chapter 25, we have from Shem's line, who was a brother of Ham, you have these two men, Sheba and Dedan. Way later, after Abraham, these are descendants of of Keturah. And it says that, these places come from there. So, it seems like the Bible's contradicting itself. Like one hand it says in Genesis 10, Sheba and Dedan come from, live in Canaan, it's telling us, but they're sons of Ham. And now we're being told, no, they're sons of Shem. What do you make of this? Well, I think the way to make sense of it is that Sheba and Dedan are places. And Sheba and Dedan were first populated and overrun and kind of became settlements in the land of Canaan from these descendants of Ham. And Genesis 10 is right. But then later in Abraham's day, these sons of Keturah, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, they settle themselves. Jokshan goes to a place. Maybe he settles in Sheba and Dedan, and he has sons. And it's such a thing that his sons dominate in the land. They become the elders, the leaders, this sort of thing. And these, in the places of Sheba and Dedan, they're no longer just sons of Ham. They're no longer Canaanite. They come from Shem through Ishmael, through Abraham and Hagar. And by way of Ishmael, they're Keturah. Through Keturah and Abraham, they become, they're dominated. If you were to go to Sheba and Dedan in these days, you would find that they're dominated by the people who own all the businesses and own all the nice houses and own all the land are from Jokshan. And so these places are dominated by the sons of Abraham. Even though they were previously populated by sons of Ham, now this descendant of Shem, who had this promise from God that that he would be made into nations, that's happening. You've got these places, and they're being sons of Dedan. These places are all place names and tribe names. They become peoples, nations. These are not just, it's not just that the place of Sheba and Dedan had a descendant of Abraham go there, and that's where they lived. They become predominantly characterized by the descendants of Abraham. And so these places belong to Abraham as his descendants. God has made him into nations. And so this is what happens. Now, okay, that's all for the details of all this stuff. I want to move on to some application, I think, which will be helpful to us. The two main things to note, I think, about Abraham is, first of all, his faithfulness God's faithfulness to Abraham concerning the fact that nations would come from him. We see that in this text, all these nations coming from him. We see that there, and we see that. So that's one thing, that he would be the father of, or not the father of nations, but the nations would come from him. That happened. And that's wonderfully encouraging. And what else do we see in terms of promises? Well, we're told, again, about these 12 kings or princes that were going to come, 12 princes. That happened. God said he was going to do that, and he did it. He said he would look after Ishmael, and he did it. He said he would make him a great nation, and he did it. God's faithfulness in every little thing we see. We see Isaac's concern to be connected to God in some way. He wants to settle in Beer Laharoi. He wants to go to the place where he knows God's eye will be upon him, and he will live under the gaze of God. And we see God then begin to bless Isaac after the death of Abraham. God was faithful to him all the way through. So we see that faithfulness. And we see the faithfulness of God to Abraham concerning Ishmael's earthly future. All that's wonderfully encouraging. All right. So those are some things that we see. Now, what is some application? Let me stop sharing the screen here and just get into looking here. So now, what do we say about all this? In terms of application, I think there's maybe two things to say. First of all, we see Abraham doing kind of all that he does, all that he can to ensure that the work of God, the promises of God, the plan of God, the purposes of God continues in the next generation after him. And that's massive. And I would say the application is we also ought to do our all to ensure that the purposes of God continue steadfastly, faithfully, where we are after we're gone. For Abraham, he knew that this meant Isaac. We don't know that. I don't know that all of my children are going to be included in the purposes of God in the next generation. I don't know that. I hope that. I pray for that. I seek God for that, but I don't know that. But I do know that the work of God is going to continue. And I do know that what happens in our church and in our community concerning the churches and the gospel proclamation and all that's there needs to be a faithful witness. Part of my job, if I'm following the example of Abraham, would be to do my part to make sure that after I'm gone, there is a gospel witness here in Hannibal, that it doesn't die out. It's not over and finished. That there are people here to carry on the work and to make sure that the kingdom of God is built even here in Hannibal. It's a big deal. I think of Paul's words to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2. Just read those. Again, I'm just trying to see Abraham as something of an example here to us. In 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says, "And what you have learned from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." He doesn't tell Timothy to faithfully teach his son, all these things, and just worry about those that are in his household and make sure that, they're getting all the Bible lessons they're supposed to have. That's your job as a father. Paul's speaking to Timothy here as an officer in the church. And he tells him, look, you need to do your part. What does he do? He says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who, not just any man, to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. I mean, in one sense, Timothy's job was to entrust these things that he heard from Paul to everybody who'd listen. But there's a special sense in which he's supposed to come and pass this on to faithful men. What faithful men? Specifically, those men who will be able to entrust it to others, who will pass it on, who have that ability. So to raise up the next generation, to set things in place before Timothy's off the scene in such a way that the church is prepared to move forward to the next generation. We see Abraham doing something like that here. As he gathers these sons of Keturah together and he sends them off. He gives them all that they need. He gives them enough so that they aren't spiteful and seeking to come back to Isaac and take what belongs to Isaac. But he sends them away nonetheless. He did right by Ishmael, as amazing as it seems. He did. Ishmael wanted to be there when Abraham died and to bury him. We don't read about those other kids being there either, just Ishmael and Isaac. So it's quite a thing. But just to say that again, that one application I think surely is the efforts we see Abraham going through. We ought to be people who make the same kind of efforts to ensure that the work of God continues. We can't be a church who our primary concern is just kind of what's happening in our home and the needs of our home, and then kind of hoping, that things are going well in the homes of other people in the church. Like, we're here, we've got a mission from God, we've got a purpose from God, we've got a calling from God. We need to do what we can to advance the gospel in the community, and not just advance it in our day, but to see to it that it can be advanced after we're gone. And so this is the first application. It's a big one. For Abraham, it meant sending the sons of Keturah, whom he probably loved. I mean, nothing about Abraham would indicate that he wouldn't have loved those children. But he had to send them away and not see their face anymore, not hug their necks anymore, because this was something he had to do. He had to set things up for Isaac. There was a real cost for him to do that. You remember him pleading with God, that Ishmael might live before you. He didn't want to. I mean, that was back whenever it was just the idea that there would be another son. Then he gets to the place where God says, cast him out. Don't give him anything. Just get a little bread and water and get rid of him, and I'll take care of him. That was hard, to entrust Ishmael and all of his future with God and not to look out for him anymore. So this is a difficult thing. So that's one application. The other thing to think about, it's similar to this. And God has faithful servants like Abraham. I mean, we look at Abraham's life and there's some mistakes and those are highlighted for us. But I mean, good grief, this guy for 75 years for 100 years rather, has followed the Lord. And He has grown. He has matured. There's not one of us who wouldn't love to sit down with Abraham and learn about godliness and about trusting the Lord and about, dealing with people faithfully who wrong you and all these sorts of things. Abraham had it. He lived the life. He did it. He's a hero. But he died. I mean, he's gone. And he can't do anything for Isaac anymore. Whatever he could do, he did, and he's out of this world now. And it's, what is God going to do with Isaac? How is Isaac going to relate to God? We're going to read in these next few chapters about, God warning Isaac about certain things and telling him things. How is he going to respond? Is he going to live by faith like Abraham did? Abraham can't do it. He's not there anymore. This faithful servant, God had poured so much into Abraham. He did so much. And remember him speaking before Sodom and Gomorrah, saying, shall I hide this from Abraham, seeing that I've chosen him to instruct his children after him? Well, guess what? The time of instruction is over. There's no more instruction. Abraham's gone. And it's just Isaac and God. And there's no Abraham. And that's a reality for us. I mean, there's a generation ahead of us who are aging, and we have looked to them and we have been blessed by them. We've asked them those questions. What does this text mean? What does God mean here? How do I apply this thing that God said? What does it mean in my life? Those people are going to be gone. And it's going to fall to us. And then we're going to be gone. It's going to fall to the next generation. So these faithful servants that are good servants of God, they serve God in their generation, and they're gone after that. And it helps us to reckon with that and to think about that ahead of time. The work's got to be carried on by the next generation. Like, we can't live on the greatness of the great faith of other men from other generations. Like, there are works to be done in our generation. God has raised up, this generation to serve this generation. And we can read from other generations, and we can read from the scriptures to be encouraged and find those examples, but it's got to be lived out practically by us now. It's not for somebody else. It's not, they say talent skips a generation. You hear those kinds of things. Well, like, the church isn't to be skipping generations. Like, it's not, well, there's this generation before us and we're just kind of receiving from them and we're happy for all that they've taught us. And we hope to teach those things to our children so they can live them out too. Like, we need to live them out. It's for us. It's for us today, right now. I think of just Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, and we'll read that and I'll close with that. Romans 15:4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. And we'll keep reading. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. What a thing. I mean, the practical application. I mean, you got all these things in the scriptures. They're written for our instruction, right? They're for our instruction for what? Through endurance. So you're going to be instructed by it, and you're going to have to go through these things, and also through the encouragement of the scriptures. These things ought to encourage you. You can have hope to press on through what you're going through now. And then he prays, may the God of endurance and encouragement grant you, give you this. What is he going to give you? To live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He's praying for the church at Rome, who's got all these divisions creeping up about what days they keep and what they eat and all this stuff, not to separate, but to be unified. And he says, look, I'm praying for you that you would examine the scriptures, be instructed by them, take encouragement from them, and then you wouldn't be divided anymore. You'd repent of your sin. You'd come together with one voice, and in Rome, you would glorify God as believers. There, you'd make a name for Christ in Rome. The application's clear. So it's just, I see the same thing here with Abraham. I mean, here he was, all that he learned, all that he did, and he's gone. And it's kind of a sad part in Genesis. It's like, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've been reading all these things from Genesis, learning these lessons with Abraham, and it's really encouraging. We think this is great. And he's just off the scene now. He's died very unceremoniously. I mean, we read a whole chapter about him bargaining for a field to bury Sarah in, and we just get a few verses about the end of his life and all these descendants that he had, and in his burial, and then it goes on to, to talk about other things. It's just very unceremonious. And it's the same way for us as believers, and believers we know, like they've had this huge impact in your life, and you can remember them in a certain way, and then all of a sudden, just suddenly, without much ceremony and pomp and circumstance, they're just gone. And it's on us, and we can't be waiting until that time. We want to serve God in our generation. We don't want our story to start, when we're 60 years old. And so, anyway, I'm not saying that's the case for us. We don't want it to be that way. Don't settle into that kind of thing. So again, just those two things. We've got to do our all right now to ensure the preparedness of God, or of the next generation for what God is doing, for the purposes of God. Are they ready, or what are we setting up? We've been given a charge. We don't think, what would it be if in 20 years people are sending missionaries to Hannibal because there aren't believers there? It'd be awful. We don't want that. We need to do our part now for this next generation. And then the second thing is just to be mindful that, the faithful servants of God, they pass, they have their time, and they move on, and God takes them, and they can't help us anymore other than by their example. But that's how they should help us, by their example, which is why I want to consider Abraham this way. He's an example for us. Look what he did. Isaac will become an example for us in some ways. And so, Lord, help us to see all this. It's a peculiar text in some ways. It seems far off and distant, but I think we can take those two things from it. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions or comments or anything they want to point out, I'm happy to listen.
Hey, yeah, I had something to maybe point out, in addition to everything you were saying. We have this passage from Romans where it talks about Abraham did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith with regard to the promises of God.
Yeah.
And I think you actually see that somewhat right up here to the end of his life. I mean, here he has all of these sons, and if your big concern is to make sure your name and your legacy endures for all time, having a lot of sons is a good way to do that. But then he goes and gives some of them just some gifts and sends them away, and he gambles everything on Isaac. Really, he gives everything to Isaac, and the question is, well, what if things don't go so well for Isaac? We have this saying about not putting all your eggs in one basket. Well, he put practically all of his eggs in Isaac's basket. But of course he did that because he trusts the Lord, and he's actually going to do what he said he was going to do, and is going to prosper Isaac and all of that. So right here, I think up until the very end, you do see the faith of Abraham at work in all of this. As strange as it is, and I know that none of us will ever have a chance to do what Abraham did in this particular passage, I mean, he shows his faith in God's promises even then. I mean, these other sons, will give them what they need to get going in life, but they're not the plan. Isaac's the plan. Abraham truly believed that. You can tell. So I thought that was something also worth mentioning as we talk about the last piece of Abraham's life here.
Good. Anyone else?
Chad, I had a question about just understanding what you were saying about those names of Sheba and Dedan and how they're mentioned in Genesis 10 under Ham, and here and under descended from Shem. Are you saying that Jokshan named his kids Sheba and Dedan because that was the name of the place where they were at?
So no, I'm not really trying to say that. I think what I'm saying is, like in Genesis 10, you have this table of nations where, it's hard to know even how many of these names are. I mean, they seem to be people's names, but they become place names, right? Like they become like geographical regions because these people who all identify themselves by a certain ancestor who was a real person mentioned in Genesis 10, like these names are significant because there are areas you could go in the world as Moses is talking and writing, that they would say, we're from this person, we're the clan of so and so, or so those are all mentioned. Well, at the same time Moses is writing, he's also talking about other ancestors, namely, Keturah's, sons who are descended from, I'm not sure who Keturah is descended from. She could be from, Ham, I guess, or a Canaanite or something, but that's irrelevant. The point is, in Abraham's line, who was a Shemite, specifically, you got these same names. And if for Moses to write about these place names in Genesis 10, where the people of Israel are going, and if you were to look actually at those names, they're all the clan names and group names surrounding the promised land and around the promised land. So it's all that area. And then he's also talking about those same places as descended from Abraham and using the same names. It's like, this is really strange. Well, evidently everybody who lived in the place that identify as Sheba and the other name there are not all from Abraham. Some of them are from this other, place. So as to how they get their names, I don't know, but at least those places become identified by the time the Israelites get into Canaan. They become identified with these descendants of Abraham, primarily through Keturah, rather than, the sons of Ham, or whatever. So it just like that's a way, and maybe there's another way to integrate those, but to me, it just seems like, you can't discredit Genesis 10 because of what Genesis 25 says, but clearly they're saying different things about these same places and the people that they're named after. So I think, I don't think there's really any other way to explain that. Maybe there are other ways that are better, but anyway, that's just my take of it. I'm not saying that he necessarily that even he named those kids that necessarily, that GEN110 did that. He may have, it may just be that, because they're, sometimes the Bible names descendants, like you have like when it mentions with Ishmael later. On the one hand, it says, now look, I'm giving you these names according to the actual sons and their birth order. And then later it says, now this is also the names of them according to their villages and encampments. It could be that the sons of Keturah, even though there's 6 that are mentioned, that then that next generation, GEN110 sons, they're mentioned by according to their villages and encampments and not according to their personal names. It could be lots of things, as to how that works. But the point is, for the people of Israel, as they enter into the land, they're to think about Sheba and this other town as having descendants both of Ham and also of Abraham through Keturah, and that they're predominantly, people who are populated by Abraham's descendants. Once Abraham got on the scene, God made him into those nations. So that's kind of what I mean. It's a little tricky, and I don't know, maybe it's a point I should have left off, but it's just you could find, I hate for somebody to go through there and have that big question, and it's kind of involved. I just felt like I could at least deal with it some in the message. So
yeah.
Anyone else, thoughts, questions, comments, disagreements, objections?